I always believed that my routine was too simple to break. At 71, my days began early, with warm coffee, organized medicines, and a silence that had already become company. I have never been one of excesses, nor of big dreams. What I had was enough, or at least I thought it was. That morning, nothing indicated that everything would fall apart in a few minutes. Until the phone rang. When I saw the unknown number, I almost ignored it. Nowadays, they only call to sell things or scam. I answered more out of boredom than curiosity. On the other side, a polite voice introduced herself as a bank employee. My heart tightened before she even continued. There is something in the formal tone that always announces trouble. I didn't know which one yet, but I felt it. Something was wrong with me. She said my full name, confirmed my data, and then spoke slowly, like someone talking to a child. He informed me that my account had been blocked on suspicion of fraud. The word fraud echoed in my head like a punch. Me? Fraud? My hands started sweating. I tried to laugh, to say that it must be a mistake, but she didn't laugh back. He just repeated, blocked. I asked what exactly had happened. The answer came too technical for me. Movements incompatible with my profile, frequent authorizations, high values. I didn't recognize any of that. My voice failed. I felt ashamed, as if I was being accused of something ugly. I wondered if they thought I was confused, senile, lost. This fear hurts more than any accusation. She asked me to go to the agency urgently. He said it was important to resolve it personally. When I hung up, I stared at the phone as if it was going to explode. My first impulse was to call my daughter. I gave up. I didn't want to bother. She was always busy. Always tired. Always with little time for me. I took a deep breath and tried to calm down on my own. I took my bag, checked the documents 3 times, as if they could disappear. In the mirror, I saw a woman smaller than I remembered being. Shoulders slumped, eyes tired. I wondered if that was how everyone saw me now, fragile, confused, dependent. That hurt me more than the blocking of the account. Money is solved. Dignity, not always. On the way to the bank, my mind was looking for simple explanations. A system error. A misunderstanding. Anything that didn't involve guilt or shame. I have never delayed bills. I never did anything hidden. I have always been careful. I repeated it like a mantra, trying to convince myself that I still had control over my own life. When I entered the branch, I felt the weight of the environment. The cold air, the people hurrying, the sound of keyboards. It all seemed too big for me. I waited my turn with my heart racing. Every second was an eternity. I didn't know it yet, but that place would be the beginning of the biggest betrayal of my life. When I was finally called, I sat down in front of the clerk and handed over my documents with trembling hands. He looked at me, then at the screen, then at me again. His gaze changed. It was not distrust. It was something worse. It was attention. It was there that I realized that the problem was not small, nor recent, nor simple. At that moment, I still believed that everything would be resolved quickly. That I would leave there relieved, perhaps ashamed, but in peace. I had no idea that this call hadn't just broken my routine. She had opened a door that I could never close. And on the other side, the most painful truth a mother can face awaited me. The fact that you are here, listening to this story so far, says a lot about your sensitivity and attention. What follows isn't just a personal account, it's a truth that reveals the extent to which trust can be wounded, and why so many stories like this are never told. If you believe these voices need to continue to be heard, subscribe to the channel, because every subscription is what keeps these stories alive. I left the bank still trying to believe that it was all just a temporary mistake. The employee asked for a few minutes to analyze it better, but said I would need to wait. Meanwhile, I went to the ATM, convinced that if the money had left there, all that embarrassment would have been useless. Inserting the card has always been an automatic gesture for me. That day, my hands trembled as if I were doing something forbidden. I typed the password carefully, taking a deep breath. The machine took longer than usual. And then came the message on the screen. Unauthorized operation. I read it once, twice, 3 times. I blinked hard, as if my eyes were betraying me. I tried again. Same answer. The dry sound of the machine returning the card seemed like a cruel warning. My face burned. I had the feeling that everyone around was watching, even though I knew that no one really cared about me. Still, I felt ashamed. A deep, silent shame that made me want to disappear from there. I moved away from the cashier slowly, as if I had just made a serious mistake. I sat in a hard chair, holding the bag to my chest. I thought about the bills I needed to pay that week. Electricity, medicine, supermarket. Simple things. Basic stuff. For the first time in many years, I realized that maybe I didn't have access to even the minimum. That gave me a childish fear, almost shameful, as if I had regressed in time. The employee approached and asked me to accompany him to his desk. The way was too calm for the confusion I felt inside. He began to explain to me what he was seeing on the screen, but I confessed that he could barely hear. Words like limit, transfer, and authorization were mixed up. All I could think was, how did this happen without me knowing? When he turned the monitor a little in my direction, I saw numbers that I didn't recognize. Values that I would never have the courage to move alone. Dates when I remembered perfectly what I was doing, and had nothing to do with the bank. I shook my head, denying it before he even asked. I said that it was not mine. That I had never made those transfers. My voice came out weak, insecure, as if I doubted myself. It was then that he asked the question that crossed me inside. He asked if anyone in the family had access to my account. I felt a tightness in my chest. I immediately thought of my daughter. She helped me sometimes. Or he said he helped. He always offered to solve these complicated things. I answered yes, but I tried to minimize it. It was my daughter. It couldn't be anything serious. I couldn't. As I spoke, I noticed that he didn't seem surprised. That bothered me more than any direct accusation. It was as if that story was not new to him. As if he had seen it before. For the first time, I thought that maybe the problem wasn't with the bank. Perhaps he was much closer to me than I would like to admit. He asked me to take a deep breath and said he needed to investigate carefully. He spoke of protection, of preventing scams. He used gentle but firm words. I felt small in that chair, depending on the goodwill of a stranger to understand what was going on with my own life. I never liked that feeling. I never imagined that I would feel this at 71. When he got up to get more information, I was alone again. I looked around and realized that everything was still the same for the world. People coming in, leaving, solving their problems. Only mine had stopped time. For the first time, a scary idea began to form in my head. What if this wasn't a mistake? What if someone was using my trust against me? At that moment, I still refused to accept this possibility. Mothers don't think badly of their children easily. I preferred to believe that, in the end, everything would have a simple explanation. But, deep down, something had already changed. The card had not worked. And with it, a part of my certainty about who I could trust was also beginning to fail. The employee returned with a briefcase in his hands and a more serious countenance than before. It was not haste, nor nervousness. It was concentration. He sat in front of me and took a deep breath before speaking, as if choosing words carefully so as not to hurt. That made me even more uneasy. People do this when they know that the news is not good. My stomach churned before he even opened his mouth. He explained that my account had a pattern of movements that did not suit me. I said this looking directly into my eyes, not at the screen. That baffled me. I always thought that banks only dealt with numbers, not people. But there, at that moment, I felt seen. Seen and evaluated. Like he was trying to understand who I was before deciding what was happening to me. He showed the statements again, now with more details. Dates, times, values. Everything organized, cold, precise. As he spoke, I made a huge effort to remember if at any time I had consciously authorized it. I didn't remember. What I remembered was trust. Of signing papers without reading properly. To hear my daughter say that it was just bureaucracy, that I didn't have to worry. I asked, almost in a whisper, if it could have been done without me noticing. He did not immediately respond. He just tilted his head and said that, unfortunately, this type of situation was more common than I imagined. The word, unfortunately, weighed like a stone. It was not a mistake. It was no coincidence. It was a type of story that repeated itself. He asked me how long I had depended on my daughter's help for financial matters. I replied that a few years ago, since I got sick and started to feel tired about complicated things. She said this trying to justify it, trying not to seem careless. But as I spoke, I realized that I was defending myself against an accusation that he never made. The accusation came from myself. When I mentioned her name, I felt something change in the air. I can't explain it properly. It was not a judgment, nor a surprise. It was confirmation. The kind of reaction someone has when an important piece finally falls into place. My heart started beating faster. For the first time, I thought that perhaps I was facing something too big to deny. He explained that some authorizations had been made in person, others digitally. All valid in the system. All made, with my consent. That expression hurt me. Consent presupposes understanding. And I never understood any of that. Signing is not consenting when you blindly trust those who are by your side. I felt like crying, but I held back. I've always been taught that crying in public is a sign of weakness. I already felt weak enough. I straightened my posture and asked him to continue. If there was something wrong, I needed to know. Even if it hurt. Even if it was too late to fix it. He said that, first of all, he needed to protect my account. He spoke of blockades, internal investigations, possible legal measures. The word cool scared me. It sounded like a court, like a scandal, like something that would get out of control. I thought about my family. I thought about Sunday lunches. I thought of the silence that would come later. When he finished, he was silent, watching me. There was no pity in his eyes. There was respect. And that gave me strength. For the first time since the call, I felt like maybe I wasn't completely alone. I still didn't know who was against me, but I was beginning to understand that someone, finally, was on my side. I left the agency with a heavy head and a restless heart. The employee asked me not to make any hasty decisions, but how not to think when everything I believed was under control began to crumble. As soon as I sat on the bench outside, I pulled out my cell phone. I spent a few seconds looking at my daughter's name on the screen. It was strange to be afraid to call my own daughter, but that was exactly what I felt at that moment. When she answered, her voice sounded hurried, as usual. He quickly asked if everything was okay, without waiting for an answer. I carefully told him that the bank had blocked my account and that I needed to understand some strange movements. There was a short silence on the other end of the line. Too short to be natural. Then, she sighed deeply, as if she were tired even before the conversation began. She said I must be confusing things. He said that banks love to complicate, that these institutions are always inventing problems. She told me not to worry, that she would solve everything later. The tone was not one of affection. It was one of control. As if I was getting in the way of something important. That bothered me deeply, but I still tried to convince myself that it was just stress. I asked directly about the transfers. He said that there were values that I did not recognize. The answer came too quickly. She said that they were my expenses, which I just didn't remember. That phrase kept echoing inside me. You don't remember. Not let's see, not let's check. Just the certainty that the problem was my memory. I felt a lump in my throat, but I kept listening. She started listing things she had supposedly paid for me. Small favors transformed into great justifications. Everything sounded rehearsed, like a ready-made speech. The more she talked, the more distant I felt from her. There was no real concern in the voice. Just impatience. As if I was disrupting a plan that was already in progress. I tried to say that the bank employee thought the situation was serious. She laughed. A short, almost mocking laugh. I said that these employees love to scare the elderly, that I shouldn't listen. That word, elderly, hurt me more than she could have imagined. It wasn't just about age. It was about putting me in a place of incapacity. When I mentioned that it might be necessary to investigate further, her voice changed. It got tougher. He said that I was exaggerating, that I could end up creating unnecessary problems for the family. He used the word family as if using a veiled threat. As if questioning were synonymous with betraying. That left me silent for a few seconds. She ended the call by saying that she would stop by the house in the next few days to sort everything out, and that I shouldn't talk to anyone else until then. When the phone went silent, I felt a chill run down my spine. That was not the daughter I raised. Or maybe it always had been, and I never wanted to see it. I sat there for a long time, watching people pass by without noticing the earthquake that was happening inside me. For the first time, the idea that someone in my own family could be deceiving me was no longer unthinkable. It was no longer a distant suspicion. It was a real, uncomfortable, painful possibility. I got up slowly and walked to the bus stop. Each step felt heavier than the last. I still didn't have proof. I was still not absolutely sure. But something inside me I already knew. The coldness in her voice, the haste to shut me up, the contempt disguised as care. None of that matched love. That night, lying in my bed, I hardly slept. I kept reliving every word of the conversation, every silence, every ready answer. For the first time, I realized that maybe I wasn't just losing money. Maybe I was missing something much bigger. The trust one placed, for years, in the wrong person. The next day, I woke up with the feeling that something inside me had aged years overnight. The sun came in through the window as usual, but I was no longer the same person who had lain there. I made coffee, sat at the table and watched the cup cool. Everything seemed too normal for the confusion that awaited me. It was strange to realize that the world doesn't change when our life falls apart. I returned to the bank with a makeshift folder of old documents. Roles that I had never questioned, contracts, authorizations, copies of identity. The employee received me with the same respect as the day before. That gave me some comfort. He began to analyze everything carefully, while I watched my every move, trying to understand how my financial life had slipped out of my hands without me noticing. When he pointed to a specific authorization, I felt my heart race. My signature was there. Unmistakable. My name, from my own hand. But I didn't remember that role. I didn't remember the day, the conversation, the explanation. It was like looking at something made by someone else using my hand. That caused me a void that is difficult to explain. He explained that, from that authorization, several movements were allowed without my presence. Regular transfers, withdrawals, payments. All done gradually, almost too carefully. It was not a quick blow. It was something built with patience. Someone who knew my habits. My fears. My confidence. As he spoke, images began to fit in my head. The times when my daughter said that I didn't need to worry. The moments when she offered to solve everything. The impatient answers when I asked too many questions. Everything that I had always interpreted as care now took on another meaning. And that hurt more than any number. I asked how much money had been moved over the years. When he told me the approximate amount, I felt short of breath. It wasn't just an amount. It was security. It was tranquility. It was the future I thought I had secured. I held on tight to the edge of the table so as not to cry. She didn't want to be seen as weak. Not now. He said something I'll never forget. He said that, many times, financial abuse starts small, almost invisible, precisely so that the victim gets used to it. That made me realize that I had been trained, little by little, not to question, to trust, to shut me up. And accepting that was one of the hardest moments of my life. I left the branch with my head held high, but inside I was in pieces. I walked slowly, feeling the weight of each step. I thought about how many times I defended my daughter when someone insinuated that she was too cold. I thought about how many times I preferred to believe in my version of a devoted mother than to see the truth that was forming before me. At home, I sat in the living room and observed everything around me. Every piece of furniture, every photo, every memory. All that could be at risk. For the first time, the threat is no longer abstract. It was no longer just money. It was my home. My independence. My dignity. Everything could be ripped from me with a signed paper years ago. Fear came strong, but along with it came something new. A silent indignation. I could be old. I could be tired. But she wasn't stupid. He was not incapable. And at that moment, a decision began to form inside me, still shy, still fragile, but real. I wasn't going to pretend nothing was happening. That evening, I organized all the documents on the table. For the first time, I didn't ask anyone for help. I read each paper carefully, even without understanding everything. I wrote down doubts. I set dates. It was little, but it was a start. The woman who entered that frightened bank was still there. But something in her was slowly beginning to wake up. I spent the whole morning surrounded by papers scattered on the living room table. Documents that had crossed years of my life without ever being questioned. Each leaf seemed to carry a piece of my naivety. Signatures, dates, complicated terms. Everything I used to push for my daughter to solve was now there, staring at me, demanding attention. It was tiring, confusing, but also revealing. As I read, old memories began to come back. Moments when I was fragile, sick, insecure. It was always in these periods that new papers to sign appeared. She said it was to make it easier, to avoid problems in the future. I trusted it. After all, she was my daughter. It never crossed my mind that someone so close could take advantage of my vulnerability. I found a specific authorization that made me stop. The date coincided with the period in which I was hospitalized for a few days. I remembered the feeling of constant tiredness, the heavy head, the desire to just rest. I remembered her sitting next to me, talking fast, saying that I needed to sign to solve some things. I signed without reading it. The memory of that moment made my stomach knot. I realized then that nothing had been done in a hurry. Everything had been planned calmly, patiently. Small permissions here, a signature there. One step at a time. Not to help, but to take control. That was no carelessness. It was strategy. And accepting that was like admitting that I had been deceived for years without realizing it. I felt angry with myself. A bitter, silent anger. I thought about how many times I defended my daughter, how many times I ignored small discomforts in the name of family peace. I had confused love with submission. Beware of obedience. And now he was paying the price for this confusion. At the same time, something began to change inside me. The more I understood what had happened, the less confused I felt. The guilt I was carrying began to lose strength. It was not forgetfulness. It was not incapacity. It was manipulation. And that made all the difference. I decided to return to the bank with those documents. Not to apologize, not to beg for help, but to understand my rights. The employee received me again, and for the first time I spoke firmly. I told him about the hospitalization, about the signatures, about blind trust. He listened attentively, without interrupting me. He confirmed something that gave me a mixture of relief and anger. He said that this pattern was typical of family financial abuse. He used that term bluntly. Abuse. Hearing that word was hard, but liberating. Suddenly, everything made sense. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't exaggerating. There was a name for what I was living. I left the agency with more information than I had in years. I walked down the street feeling the weight of truth, but also a strange sense of clarity. The past, which had once seemed solid, now showed deep cracks. And through them, I began to see who was really by my side, and who had never been. That night, when I went to bed, I felt afraid of what was yet to come. I knew that confronting my daughter would not be easy. I knew that the family could turn against me. But for the first time since the call, I slept with a new certainty. That no matter what happened, I wouldn't pretend I didn't see it anymore. The past had cracked. And there was no longer any way to fix it with silence. I returned to the bank a few days later, thinking I had seen the worst. I was wrong. The employee called me to a reserved room, something that had not happened before. That detail alone made my heart race. He said that, as he deepened the analysis, he found something that completely changed the size of the problem. I asked him to speak soon. I no longer had the strength to rodeo. He showed me a history that went far beyond the transfers I already knew. Old, constant movements, small at first, almost invisible. It was as if someone had learned exactly how far they could go without arousing suspicion. Year after year, the pattern repeated itself. It was not recent. He was not impulsive. That had been going on for more than a decade. As he spoke, my mind went back in time. I remembered the period when I was widowed. Of loneliness. From the fear of not being able to handle everything alone. It was there that my daughter began to help more. It was there that I started to trust everything to her. Realizing that the beginning of the betrayal coincided with the most fragile moment of my life caused me almost physical pain. The employee pointed to a specific document. A request for capacity assessment, made years ago, which never advanced, but was registered. That chilled me inside. Someone had quietly considered declaring me incapable. It wasn't just money. It was never just money. It was control. It was power. It was to erase myself little by little. I asked who had initiated that request. Even though I already knew the answer, I heard my daughter's name as if it were the first time. I felt a mixture of nausea and disbelief. She didn't just steal from me. She was preparing to take away my autonomy, my voice, my freedom. All this while calling me mom and saying that she took care of me. I left the room with wobbly legs. I sat in a chair in the hallway and stood there, trying to breathe. It was difficult to accept that the person I defended for years had calmly built my ruin. The love I felt didn't disappear immediately. It mixed with pain, anger, and a deep sense of betrayal. At that moment, I realized something important. If I remained silent, her plan would be completed. I would lose my house, my money, my independence. Maybe I would even be placed somewhere where my opinion didn't matter anymore. The threat is no longer future. It was already underway. And I needed to act. The clerk sat next to me and spoke with a quiet firmness. He said there was still time. That I was not alone. That there were legal ways to stop it. For the first time, I didn't feel like a confused old woman being mentored. I felt like a woman being informed. The difference is huge. I left the bank that day different from how I entered. The weight of the secret was enormous, but along with it came a painful clarity. I had been deceived for years. That would not change. But what would happen from then on was still in my hands. And this idea, for the first time, gave me strength. At home, I sat in the living room in absolute silence. I looked at the old photos, at the smiling faces that now looked strange. I cried, yes, but not of despair. I cried in mourning. For the past I thought I had lived. For the family I thought I had built. That version of my life was over. When I wiped my face, I did something I had never done before. I took a new notebook and wrote on the first page, "What is mine?" Below, I started listing everything I needed to protect. My house. My name. My story. My freedom. At that moment, without realizing it, I was no longer just a victim. I was starting to prepare for war. Over the next few days, I began to notice subtle changes around me. Small things, almost invisible to those who are not attentive. The key to my house was no longer exactly where I left it. Drawers seemed to have been moved. Nothing disappeared immediately, but the feeling of invasion grew every morning. It was as if someone was preparing to take everything, little by little, being careful not to arouse suspicion. My daughter started calling me more often, but not to ask how I was. The calls had a different tone. Questions disguised as concern, insistent suggestions about making things easier, comments about my age and my tiredness. She spoke of rest, of safety, of no longer having to worry about responsibilities. Every word seemed kind, but I could already hear what was behind them. In one of these conversations, she mentioned the house. She said that maybe it would be better for me to think about selling, or passing it on to her name to avoid problems in the future. He spoke as if he were doing a favor. My heart raced. The house was not just a property. It was the last space that was still mine alone. The idea of losing her made the threat real, concrete, suffocating. I also began to notice the change in the behavior of other family members. Some had become more distant. Others started to repeat phrases similar to those of my daughter, as if they were rehearsed. They said that I was very nervous, that maybe it would be good for someone to assume certain decisions for me. The word assume began to sound like a sentence. It was as if, little by little, my voice was being taken away from me. One afternoon, I found a strange envelope among my mail. It was just a generic pamphlet about elder care, but something bothered me deeply. I remembered the document that the bank employee had mentioned, that old request for a capacity assessment. I realized that the plan had not been abandoned. He was just asleep, waiting for the right moment to wake up. Fear began to mix with paranoia, and it scared me even more. I started to doubt myself at times. Was I exaggerating? Was he seeing threats where none existed? It was then that I remembered the evidence, the statements, the documents. It was not imagination. It was strategy. And the target was me. I decided that I could no longer face this alone. I went back to the bench and asked for more direct guidance. The official was clear. He said that if I didn't act, other people would act for me. The phrase kept hammering in my head. To act or to be acted upon. There was no middle ground. For the first time, I understood that being silent was also a choice, and the worst of them. I started to change small habits. I started to keep documents in different places. I wrote down dates, times, conversations. Everything that I once thought was exaggerated now seemed like prudence. I wasn't becoming suspicious. I was protecting myself. And that difference made all the difference inside me. The nights got longer. He slept little, woke up with his heart racing. I thought about the possibility of waking up one day and discovering that everything was no longer mine. That someone had decided for me. This idea took my breath away. But at the same time, he nurtured a new determination. I had not survived 71 years to be erased in silence. I realized then that the threat did not come only from losing material possessions. It was the risk of losing my identity, my history, my autonomy. And I couldn't allow that. The woman who started this frightened journey still felt fear, yes. But now the fear was accompanied by something stronger. A firm will not to disappear. That night, I closed the house more carefully than ever and sat down at the table with my notebook open. I reviewed the list I had written days before. I added a new line, written in firm handwriting, my decision. I still didn't know exactly how I would fight, but one thing was clear. I wouldn't be taken away without reacting. There was a day when I just couldn't get out of bed. The body was heavy, but it was not physical fatigue. It was as if the full weight of truth had settled on me during the night. I stared at the ceiling, trying to organize my thoughts, but they came in confusing waves. Everything I believed about my life seemed to have been dismantled piece by piece. I began to wonder if it would have been better not to discover anything. If living in ignorance it would not have been easier. There was a deep pain in knowing that the betrayal came from where I least expected it. It wasn't just the money. It was the false affection, the rehearsed words, the gestures that now seemed calculated. This made me doubt even the good memories. I spent hours revisiting the past, looking for signs I had ignored. Small comments, impatient looks, decisions made without consulting me. Everything was there. It always has been. I chose not to see it. This realization crushed me. The guilt came back with force, even though I knew, rationally, that I had been manipulated. Emotion does not follow logic. At some point, I seriously thought about giving up. To let my daughter take over everything, as she wanted. Maybe it would be easier. Maybe I could live peacefully, without conflicts, even if it meant losing autonomy. The idea of fighting, of facing lawyers, of exposing one's family terrified me. I was too tired for wars. I got out of bed just to close the curtains. I didn't want to see the world. He didn't want to answer messages. Nor does he answer the phone. Silence seemed safer than any conversation. For the first time, I felt afraid of myself. Fear of accepting everything out of exhaustion, not conviction. I sat on the couch and cried like I hadn't cried in years. A silent, contained, but deep cry. I cried for the woman I was, for the mother I tried to be, for the trust one gave without reservation. I cried for the loneliness that only increases when the betrayal comes from within the family. That was the emotional rock bottom. Through tears, my eyes fell on the notebook on the table. The same where I had written, "What is mine?" I picked it up without much desire, just to flip through it. When I saw my own handwriting, something changed. That list had been made by me. Not for his daughter. Not by anyone. For me. And it mattered more than I had realized. I read each item slowly. Home. Name. History. Freedom. None of them were small. None of them were replaceable. I realized that giving up would mean giving up everything I still was. Not just what I had. And that realization hurt, but it also ignited something inside me. I remembered the words of the bank employee. There is still time. That phrase came back with force. If there was time, there was choice. And if there was a choice, I wasn't just a passive victim. I still had a voice, even though it was weak at the time. I took a deep breath, wiped my face and opened the notebook again. On the next page, I wrote something simple but decisive: I will not disappear. It was not a plan. It was not full courage. But it was a decision. And sometimes, this is what separates the end from the possibility of a new beginning. That night, still afraid, still exhausted, I lay down knowing that I had reached the lowest point. But for the first time, I understood something fundamental. From the bottom of the well, there are only two possible directions. And I was slowly starting to choose to go up. This is the hardest part to tell, because by exposing this moment I give up the silence that protected me for years. Revealing this means reliving the pain, shame, and loss that changed my life forever. If you've come this far with me, it's because you understand that certain truths only survive when someone has the courage to say them out loud. So I ask you to sign up, not as a support for me, but as a gesture so that stories like this are not erased. The next day, I returned to the bank with a quiet decision hammering in my head. I was still afraid, but he no longer paralyzed me as before. It was an attentive, vigilant fear. The employee greeted me with a discreet wave, as if he already knew that this visit was not just another one. There was something different about me, and he noticed before I even said anything. I sat in front of him and, for the first time, spoke without apologizing. He said that he no longer just wanted to understand what had happened, he wanted to know what he could do. My words came out firm, even with a low voice. He didn't seem surprised. He just nodded, as if waiting for exactly that moment. That gave me a strange sense of respect. He explained that there were specific protocols for cases like mine. He talked about financial abuse, about protection of the elderly, about formal records. He used clear, direct terms, without treating me as someone incapable of understanding. Each sentence of his dismantled a little of the idea that my own family tried to impose on me, that I was no longer capable of deciding anything on my own. He showed me a series of documents that could be requested, possible legal paths, immediate preventive measures. He also spoke about the importance of acting before any request for interdiction was reactivated. That confirmed my worst fears, but it also brought relief. I wasn't imagining things. There was, in fact, something afoot, and there was still time to stop it. I asked him if he had ever seen similar situations. He took a deep breath before answering yes, many. He said that, most of the time, the scam only came to light when it was too late. He told stories of people who lost everything without ever being heard. That gave me goosebumps. But then he completed something that changed everything. He said that my case was still at the beginning of the end, not the end of the beginning. For the first time in days, I felt hope. Not a naive hope, but a concrete one. Those that come with hard work and difficult choices. He offered to help me organize the evidence, to formalize internal complaints, to seek specialized legal advice. Not because he had to, but because he believed that it was the right thing. I left the agency with a to-do list in my hands. Small, objective, possible. That may seem simple, but for me it was revolutionary. I had a plan, albeit an initial one. And, more importantly, there was someone who didn't treat me like a burden, nor like a child. I was a person with rights. And that changed everything. On the way back, I noticed that my posture was different. She walked more upright. I observed more. It was not full confidence, but it was awareness. I was waking up from a long period of submission disguised as love. And waking up hurts, but it also liberates. I got home and, first of all, organized the documents as he had directed. I separated statements, contracts, authorizations. All in chronological order. For the first time, I didn't feel lost in front of the paperwork. Each organized sheet was a small act of resistance. A silent reminder that I still had control. When I finished, I sat down at the table and remained silent for a few minutes. I thought about the irony of it all. A stranger had become my ally, while my own daughter had become a threat. That hurt, but it also clarified. Family is not who calls you that. It's the one who doesn't erase you. That night, I slept better than the previous days. Not because the problems had disappeared, but because I was no longer alone in them. For the first time since the call, I felt that the tables had started to turn. And I no longer intended to play as a victim. I woke up that morning with a different feeling. The fear was still there, but it no longer occupied all the space inside me. He shared a place with something new, still fragile, but insistent. A willingness to act. Not only to react to events, but to lead them. It was strange to realize that this force had always been in me, just dormant. I prepared the coffee more calmly than in the previous days. While the water boiled, I mentally went over everything I needed to do. Phone calls, documents, decisions. Before, just thinking about it made me feel tired. Now, despite the emotional weight, there was clarity. And clarity brings focus. Focus brings strength. I started organizing the papers again, this time with another look. She was no longer a woman trying to understand what had happened. It was someone gathering evidence. Each statement, each authorization, each date gained meaning. I started to see patterns, repetitions, strategies. Confusion began to give way to understanding. And understanding is an act of power. I received a message from my daughter that day. Short, direct, controlling. He asked if I had already solved that mess at the bank and remembered that I would stop by home soon. For the first time, I didn't feel afraid when reading. I felt alert. And the alert is different. He does not respond impulsively. Observe. Analyzes. Decide. I answered neutrally, almost coldly. He only said that he was solving some things. Nothing more. When I sent the message, I realized something important. I no longer needed to explain myself. For years, I got used to justifying every decision, every doubt. Now, silence was my choice. And that would bother her more than any direct confrontation. In the afternoon, I returned to the bank to deliver some additional documents. The employee received me with a slight smile, one of those who do not promise miracles, but recognize effort. He noticed my change. He commented that I was firmer. That touched me deeply. An outsider saw something that my own family refused to see. We talked about the next steps objectively. No dramatization. No pity. It was strategy. Deadlines, registrations, legal possibilities. I left there with the certainty that each action needed to be thought out carefully. It's not just about winning a dispute. It's about not getting lost in the process. On the way back, I observed my reflection in a shop window. I saw an older woman, yes, with marks of time on the face and body. But I also saw something that I hadn't seen in a long time: presence. I was there, whole, not diminished, not erased, just wounded, and aware of it. I got home and started doing something symbolic. I separated clothes, objects, papers. Not to throw away, but to regain control. That house was mine. That story was mine. Every little gesture of organization seemed to say it out loud. I was no longer waiting for someone to decide for me. In the evening, I sat down at the table and wrote in the notebook another sentence, below the original list. I'm in charge. As I wrote, I felt a shiver. Not because it was easy to believe, but because I was starting to act like it was true. And often, change starts exactly like that. I lay down with a tired but firm mind. I knew the confrontation was yet to come. That there would be pain, accusations, perhaps irreversible losses. But something essential had already happened. I was no longer the woman cornered by her own family. I was waking up. And those who wake up after so long hardly accept going back to sleep. In the days that followed, my life went into a strange, almost military rhythm. Each morning began with a clear list of what needed to be done. Phone calls, meetings, documents. I had never lived like this. I was always the type who solved everything on the fly, trusting people more than papers. Now, every detail mattered. Every piece of evidence could be the difference between being heard or being silenced. The bank clerk referred me to a lawyer who specializes in cases like mine. Setting up that meeting was one of the hardest acts I've ever done. Not because I doubted the necessity, but because it made everything official. Until then, part of me still pretended that this was too big a misunderstanding. Sitting in front of a lawyer meant admitting that my own daughter had crossed a line of no return. In the meeting, I told my story from beginning to end. I didn't romanticize anything. I didn't soften the pain. I spoke of the signatures, the trust, the growing coldness, the attempts at control. As I spoke, he wrote everything down carefully. At no time did he interrupt me. When I finished, he said something simple but powerful: "You have a strong case." It made me breathe better for the first time in weeks. He explained what the next steps would be: formal notifications, definitive blocks, complete audits. He also spoke about the possibility of my daughter trying to defend herself by claiming incapacity on my part. That hypothesis chilled my blood. But, at the same time, it prepared me. I needed to be ready to be attacked exactly where they had always tried to weaken me. I then began to gather everything that proved who I was. Medical consultations, exams, statements, testimonies. Not to prove that I was perfect, but that I was lucid, capable, owner of me. Each document gathered was an anticipated response to the lies to come. I would no longer wait to be accused to defend myself. My daughter kept trying to contact me. Messages that are too polite, invitations to talk calmly, insistence on solving everything as a family. I read everything without answering. For the first time, I didn't let myself be seduced by the emotional appeal. I understood that this request for conversation was not about reconciliation. It was about control. And I was no longer willing to give in. There was a moment when I missed the simple life I had before all this. From the illusion that family was always a safe haven. This longing hurt more than the anger. But I learned to live with it without letting it paralyze me. Not every loss is visible. Some are internal, silent, and yet definitive. At night, he mentally reviewed what he would say when the confrontation came. He did not rehearse accusations. He rehearsed firmness. I didn't need to scream to be heard. I needed to be prepared not to back down. The woman I was becoming was no longer dependent on anyone's approval. I was afraid, yes. Fear of being alone. Fear of judgment from others. Fear of hearing distorted versions of my own story. But this time, fear didn't push me back. He kept me attentive, vigilante, present. It was a fear that protected, not dominated. Deep down, I knew that this confrontation would not only be with my daughter. It would be with everything that I accepted in silence throughout my life. Each time I diminished myself to avoid conflicts. Every time I confused love with excessive sacrifice. What was at stake was not only justice. It was identity. When I closed the folder with all the documents organized, I felt something very close to pride. Not because of the conflict itself, but because of the woman I had become until then. The confrontation was approaching. And for the first time, I didn't fear him. I was ready to face the truth, standing, with name, story, and voice. The day of the confrontation came faster than I expected. I woke up before the alarm clock, with my heart beating firmly, not racing. It was a different kind of anxiety. Not the one that paralyzes, but the one that keeps the senses attentive. I chose the outfit carefully, not to impress anyone, but to feel whole. I wanted to look in the mirror and recognize the woman who was about to speak for herself. I arrived at the lawyer's office a few minutes before the time. My hands were cold, but my mind was clear. When my daughter entered the room, accompanied by her husband, I felt a physical impact. It wasn't nostalgia. It wasn't love. It was the definitive realization that that relationship had been crossed by something that had no return. She looked at me quickly, as if evaluating terrain, not as someone who sees her own mother. The lawyer started the meeting with formality. He explained the reason for the meeting, presented the documents, spoke in legal terms. As he spoke, I watched my daughter. She crossed her arms, rolled her eyes, sighed impatiently. The same posture I used when I complicated things. That, which used to silence me, now only confirmed everything. When it was my turn to speak, the room fell silent. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I told the facts calmly, in the right order. I spoke of the signatures, the transfers, the old request for interdiction. Each word was supported by a document. There was no room for alternative versions. For the first time, my story could not be distorted. My daughter tried to interrupt. He said that he always took care of me, that everything he did was for my good. The lawyer asked her to wait. That visibly bothered her. Being prevented from controlling the narrative was something new for her. When he finally spoke, he tried to paint me as confused, emotional, influenceable. Hearing that hurt. But it didn't disarm me. I took a deep breath and answered. He said that care is not done in secret. That love is not built by taking away rights. That trust does not authorize theft. As I spoke, I realized something important. I wasn't defending myself. He was asserting limits. And that completely changes the weight of words. The most tense moment came when the lawyer presented the final evidence. Statements, authorizations, cross-dates with periods when I was hospitalized. The silence that followed was heavy. My daughter turned pale. Her husband looked away. There, any argument lost strength. The truth was exposed, raw, impossible to ignore. She tried to justify it. He said that he intended to give it back, that he didn't think I would understand, that it was just a way of organizing things. Every sentence was a dry blow. Not because it surprised me, but because it confirmed what I already knew. There was no apology. There was only an attempt to minimize the damage. The lawyer ended the meeting by making it clear what the next legal steps would be. Consequences. Responsibilities. No empty promise. Just facts. When we got up, my daughter tried to get closer to me. Not to ask for forgiveness, but to regain some control. I took a step back. Not out of hatred. By lucidity. I left that room feeling a mixture of pain and relief. The pain of confirming that I was right. The relief of no longer being alone with the truth. The confrontation had taken place. Not the way I dreamed, but the way it needed to be. Public. Cool. Irrefutable. Outside, I took a deep breath and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Not because everything was solved, but because I had done what needed to be done. I hadn't been silent. He had not backed down. And on that day, for the first time in years, I walked knowing exactly who I was, and who I no longer needed to protect. In the days following the confrontation, silence took over my life in a different way. It was no longer the silence of ignorance, but that of rupture. Some family members stopped calling. Others sent short, cautious messages, as if they didn't know which side to be on. Truth has this effect. It not only reveals culprits, it forces everyone to take a stand. My daughter tried to contact her a few times. Long, confusing messages, mixing justifications with veiled accusations. In some, he said that I had destroyed the family. In others, that he just wanted to solve everything without lawyers. None contained a sincere request for forgiveness. Only regret for having been discovered. Reading that hurt, but it no longer confused me. The legal process moved forward with a speed that I did not expect. Definitive blocks were applied, investigations opened, values tracked. Each notification that came in was a reminder that this was no longer just a personal conflict. It had become a fact. A record. Something that could no longer be swept under the rug in the name of familiar appearance. There were those who judged me. I heard comments that I should have solved everything at home, that money is not worth a fight between mother and daughter. Those words hurt me deeply. Not because I agreed, but because they revealed how much they expect women like me to endure everything in silence. As if dignity were a luxury, not a right. There were also those who approached. A distant cousin called me crying, saying that she experienced something similar and never had the courage to react. A neighbor started to visit me more often. Small gestures, simple, but that reminded me that the world is not just about the family that hurts us. There are bonds that are born of empathy, not blood. At home, I had to deal with the echo of absences. Photographs that I still didn't have the courage to keep. Objects that carried memories now tarnished. There were days when I missed the illusion more than the person. The illusion that everything was fine. That I was protected. Losing this costume was one of the hardest parts of the whole process. At the same time, I began to notice changes in myself. I no longer asked permission for anything. She solved matters by herself. He made decisions without consulting anyone. Each small autonomy recovered worked as an antidote against pain. I was rebuilding my life, not from what was taken from me, but from what was still mine. My daughter eventually stopped trying to make direct contact. The removal became official, cold, definitive. There was no farewell. Just distance. That hurt in a silent, persistent way. But it also brought me a strange peace. There was no more manipulation. There was no more emotional play. Just reality, naked and clear. I understood, then, that the truth exacts a high price. It costs relationships, comfort, false securities. But the price of lying is always higher, even when it seems easier. I paid dearly, yes. But I paid consciously. And that makes all the difference. When I sat alone in the living room, on a quiet night, I realized something that moved me deeply. I was sad, but I wasn't broken. She was injured, but not diminished. The truth had passed me by like a storm, but instead of destroying me, it had left me standing. And no one could take that away from me. Time passed in a different way after all. No longer dragged by anguish, nor accelerated by anxiety. He just followed. And I went along. There were good days and hard days, but none of them were lived in lies. This, in itself, was already a quiet victory. I had lost a lot, but I had recovered something that is priceless, myself. I recovered part of the money, it is true, but not all. Some values would never come back, and I had to accept that without consuming myself. I learned that justice does not always give back everything that was taken away, but it gives back limits. And boundaries change destinies. My home remained mine. My name remained clear. My autonomy, intact. That was the essential thing. I started to take care of my things with renewed attention. Not out of fear, but out of awareness. I learned to ask, to read, not to sign anything without understanding. It was not distrust. It was respect for myself. The woman I became after all no longer needed to prove strength to anyone. It simply existed, firm. The relationship with my daughter was never rebuilt. There were distant, cold attempts, full of pride and silence. None of them went through what was broken. And for the first time, I accepted it without guilt. Some wounds were not made to heal together. Some teach separation. And this is also maturation. Interestingly, my life didn't get shorter after the loss. It's simpler. More honest. New people approached, not out of interest, but out of presence. True conversations began to occupy the space that was previously filled by tension disguised as family. I discovered that bonds don't need blood to be real. There were nights when I missed the woman I was before I knew everything. Of naivety, of false security, of manufactured peace. But this longing came with no desire to return. Because I knew that peace was too expensive. Today, my tranquility is built on the truth, and that makes it more solid. I started to help other women my age, talking, guiding, alerting. Not as an expert, but as someone who survived. Many listened to me attentively. Others are afraid. All with recognition. Turning my pain into an alert was a way to make sense of what I experienced. When I look in the mirror now, I see a marked woman, yes. But not broken. I see someone who has been underestimated, betrayed, almost erased, and yet has remained standing. I didn't have to scream. I didn't have to take revenge. It was enough not to disappear. I understood that aging is not losing strength. It is to learn where she really lives. And mine has never been in money, nor in the perfect family, nor in the approval of others. It was always in my ability to resist when everything seemed to want to push me into silence. Today, I move forward differently. Not better in the naive sense of the word, but more whole. I haven't recovered the past. I regained control. And that changed everything. Because they may have tried to take a lot from me. But they failed in the most important thing. I continue to own my own story. If this story touched you at any point, please share this video. Not just as entertainment, but as a warning about patterns of silence, abuse, and betrayal that are still repeated in many families. By sharing, you can get that message to exactly who needs to hear right now, someone who doesn't yet know they're not alone and who deserves to protect themselves. I'll stay here reading each comment carefully. Tell me, from which city and country are you watching, and what about this story stayed with you? Your words really matter to me.